Cindy Chupack.
Thanks. It was 5 days before my 10-year high school reunion when my husband told me he thought he might be gay. He wasn't sure he was gay because he had never been with a man yet, but he thought it was something he ought to figure out. Good idea. Now, I think he told me this at that moment, not to get out of my high school reunion, which would be understandable, but in order to, because we'd been looking for houses together, and we'd finally found one in Pasadena that we both liked. And I think somehow the forever of a wedding vow sounded kind of vague and idealistic to him, whereas 30-year mortgage was surprisingly specific. It was a commitment, you know, the kind of commitment you shouldn't make while your sexuality is pending. So... Now, as he was explaining this to me, I was thinking, downstairs, our neighbors, we lived in this duplex apartment we were renting. The Kaufmans were probably just sitting down to dinner, as they'd done for 52 years, and talking about their brisket. And they were this couple that used to come up and see our new furniture, like when we bought a new antique table, because Sam liked antique shopping. Pink flag. And they were like parent figures to us. And you know, there were signs. Like when I first met Sam, he had this leather jacket with tiger print lining, and I remember thinking, it seemed kind of, the lining, I don't know, it stuck with me. And then, but then he asked me out, and we slept together, and he asked me to marry him, and I put on the big white dress, which he helped me pick out, in front, seriously, in front of, 200 my closest friends, and I figured he's not. And also, there was one thing I ignored, which I probably should have paid attention to. He told me while we were engaged, he told me he sometimes noticed men, but he said he couldn't imagine sleeping with a man, and he just noticed them. And I guess I knew this was not good because I didn't talk to any girlfriends about this, and I talked to girlfriends about everything. So if I didn't, it was probably bad. But at one point I did talk to one girlfriend. We were in line at Disneyland for Space Mountain, and I told her how Sam had said he sometimes noticed men, and do you think that's bad? And she said, she told me this theory of the spectrum of sexuality, and everyone lies somewhere along it, and some people notice people, but they would never act on it. And 4 years later, she realized she was a lesbian. So, my one person I confessed to. So as I was recalling all these signs, I realized Sam was still talking. And he was telling me he felt so much better getting this off his chest, and he'd been wanting to tell me for a long time. And he felt so relieved he kind of wanted to have sex. And I said, with who? And he said, with you. And I think he meant it as a compliment, but I have to go to bed and wake up when the bookstores are open. So the next day, I went directly to the self-help section where all problems could be solved, and there was no book for someone whose husband thought he might be gay. There was a book called Loving Someone Gay, but it turned out to be for teachers and family members, but nothing. And I was nervous because this is LA, and I didn't want to pioneer a problem. This is a very bad sign. And as I'm looking for a book, any book, I remember I saw one called How to Survive Alien Abduction. And it wasn't a humor book, it was a serious book with things like block their mind control and, get help from on high. And so basically, according to the laws of supply and demand, you're more likely to be abducted by an alien than to have your husband realize he's gay. That's what that said to me. And so I left the self-help section despondent and decided that it was time to go to therapy. 4 days now from my high school reunion. So I went for the first time. I had never gone to therapy. I grew up in Oklahoma, which is where my reunion was going to be. And there was this thing called the Gold Group, because I was in the Writers Guild. Basically, when I became a comedy writer, I decided my husband no longer wanted to be a straight man. That was basically what happened there. And so I was in the Writers Guild, and they paid for this. This is true. They paid for this thing called the Gold Group, and it was a group of therapists in the Valley. And it was only a $10 copay. And it's possible you shouldn't skimp on therapy, but I thought I was going to be in for a while. So I went to the Gold Group, and I remember when I got in there, you basically get what you co-pay for, because I was in this office waiting for my therapist, and I could hear the session next to me. It was this paper-thin wall, and I could hear a man sobbing And I was like, they're going to hear me sobbing. And then when my therapist came in, she turned on this little oscillating fan, which I think is the system the Gold Group had come up with to deal with the soundproofing problem. And and my therapist, and I didn't have anything to compare against, but I just remember noting she was very badly dressed, like pink and red together and stripes. And I thought, she can't put together an outfit, and she has to put together my whole life. This is not good. So, and she had all these questions I hadn't even thought of, like, do you think should you be HIV tested, and maybe he's lying and he's been cheating on you? And she had a lot of anger that we worked on. So she felt better. Okay, so I proceeded. My decision was to go to the reunion with Sam and pretend everything was fine, because it seemed better than. One problem was Sam wasn't ready to come out because he hadn't started. When he told me he thought he might be gay, he said, maybe I'll only be 30% gay, I'll find out, and then I could still be with you. And I was overwhelmed at the moment, but I do remember thinking, so he'll sleep with 10 men and enjoyed 3 of them? I'm confused how we're gonna do the math of this. So he hadn't started that experiment yet. So he wasn't ready to come out because he didn't know yet. So we just went to my reunion like that. So we stayed with my parents, which is not a fun thing even when your husband doesn't think he might be gay. And I remember at the reunion I won most successful, and I just was like, yeah, and my husband's gay. So if it was Oklahoma, the runner-up was like the manager of the Foot Locker, so it wasn't a huge honor. But anyway, I remember when I went home, I was really nervous about my mom. Because my mom, it was like being, that scene in My Fair Lady when the linguistic experts asked her to dance? That's how it was being alone with my mom with this secret. Because my mom, like right now, she would say, your voice sounds a little tight, honey. Like she's very eagle eye about these emotional things. And I kept worrying and trying to avoid her. And I completely forgot about my dad. And at one point, he was sitting there watching ESPN, and he said, is everything okay? And I said, no, if everything was okay, Sam would be in here watching ESPN with you instead of in the kitchen flipping through House Beautiful with Mom. and I basically told my dad everything, which is not the system in my house. You tell my mom, and my mom tells my dad. But I told my dad. And then I remembered why I don't ever tell my dad, because he was like, he thought it was as if Sam was asking permission to have an affair, and I should just say no. So in fact, his words were, I'd like to sleep with Debbie Reynolds, but your mom's not gonna let me. Which I was like, but what if you wanted to sleep with Burt Reynolds? And to his credit, he had no experience with this. In college, he had one, there was one guy in his fraternity that everyone knew had realized he was gay and left his wife and kids, Jerry Hobbleman, and no one had ever heard from him again. That was like his whole experience with the gay population. So he was no help. And somehow, though, Sam and I survived my high school reunion, but Mr. Kaufman, who lived downstairs, did not survive the weekend. He had died in his sleep of a heart attack, and there was a funeral. And I remember it was kind of a highlight for me because I had been crying in such inappropriate places all week. And finally, I was at a funeral, and I could just sob, even though I think it was odd to people because they were like, is she the tenant? Because I was kind of losing it. Like grabbing Kleenex from the mother, But I remember I was there with Sam, and we were holding hands, and we were thinking, I was thinking, at least at a funeral there's a body and a grave and something tangible to mark the end, and with a relationship it's never so clearly marked. And it was a relief to be there with Sam for closure. And then it being a Jewish funeral, there was a need for a minyan where they needed 10 men to go. And I remember thinking, don't go with the men to Sam. I did not want him to go with the men. But then finally I said go, and I realized I meant it in the largest sense possible. And about a week later, my dad called me, and he said, it's really 99% genetic, this whole homosexuality thing. And I was completely thrown and thought maybe he'd been on the internet and researching, and it turned out that my dad had called Jerry Hobbleman and asked him to lunch. he had tracked down this man and took him to Denny's. and I'm sure there were lots of disclaimers because my dad does not take men to lunch, so he probably was afraid it would sound like a date or something. And I'm sure when he showed up in shorts and black dress socks and loafers, it was clear he was not of the gay persuasion. but he asked Jerry all the things he wanted to ask. And couldn't, like, could you have avoided this, and did you ever regret it, and is your wife okay? And it was maybe the nicest thing a father ever did, taking Jerry Hoppelman to lunch. And just about a week after that, Sam was finally moving out. And I remember we were in the top floor of our duplex, and downstairs Mrs. Kaufman was gardening like she always did. And Sam hadn't talked to her yet because she was like a parent figure, and he still wasn't ready to come out, and he wasn't dealing with things as he hadn't dealt with many things. And so I said, you have to tell her, because the moving van's going to be here any minute, and she's going to wonder, and he wouldn't. So I went downstairs to talk to her, and I remember she'd always loved gardening, but it was really about, she seemed more desperate than ever to kind of keep things alive, nurture the living things and not to let things slip away. And she couldn't imagine why I was letting my husband slip away, and I couldn't explain to her. And so we just sat together on this bench, shoulder to shoulder, two women, alone but not really alone, as the moving van lumbered over to the sidewalk. Thank you.
Giving Chupack.